Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. If you are joining us from Montreal or any other part of the Eastern Standard Time Zone. Good morning if you are connecting from the North American West Coast. And of course, a beautiful and peaceful good evening if you are joining us, as many do, from Israel. My name is Csaba Mikolényi. I'm director of the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies, and also I'm a professor at the Department of Political Science here at Concordia University in Montreal. And this is where we are live telecasting onto your screen this conversation today. We are meeting today for what would be under ordinary circumstances a festive event. The launching of the second title in the McGill Queen's University Press, Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies series in Israel Studies. The book in question is a collection of essays, co-edited and brought together in an important volume by Dr. Rachel Feldman, who is sitting here with us, and Ian McGonigle. The title of the book is Settler Indigeneity in the West Bank. The book was published earlier this year. This important book asks what Israeli settlers mean when they say they are indigenous, how settler indigeneity is felt, performed, and mediated. Considering a range of topics, including agriculture, clothing, food, language, religious practices, the various chapters in this volume explore how feelings of indigeneity are fashioned and how these feelings continue to transform the landscape of the West Bank. One of the contributing authors in the book, Dr. Hayim Katsman Z, his memory be a blessing, a brilliant young scholar, member of the faculty at Hadassah Academic College, and a member of the Association for Israel Studies, lost his life in the brutal savagery that Hamas, the Islamic resistance movement, inflicted on Israel on October 7th, in what we now know was the worst massacre of the Jewish people since the Holocaust. Hayim was no longer alive when the hard copies of the freshly published book were shipped to the authors. But thanks to the initiative and the cooperation of Dr. Feldman, as well as Dr. Richard Retzlaff, who is also sitting here with us, senior acquisition editor at McGill Queen's University Press and press editor of the Israel Studies series, we are very honored to share with you the launching of this book, which we are dedicating to Hayim's memory. In a few minutes, Hayim's doctoral supervisor, Professor Joel Migdal, will be joining us from Jerusalem, and he will share with us a few minutes of intimate reflection about Hayim's life and legacy. Those who would like to read more about Hayim, please read the essay that was recently penned by Randy Pinsky, features writer and editor, also with us here today at the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies. Before I would like to turn the screen and the microphone over to Professor Migdal, I would like to introduce briefly the authors and the editor who are here with us at this book launch. Our first speaker after Professor Migdal will be Dr. Rachel Z. Feldman, who is a cultural anthropologist specializing in Judaism, Israel-Palestine, Messianic movements, feminist, and post-colonial studies. She holds a PhD from the University of California, Davis, and a master's degree from the New School of Social Research. She is author of the Hot Off the Press volume, Messianic Zionism in the Digital Age, Jews, Noahides, and the Third Temple Imaginary, which is technically officially published this spring by Rutgers University Press. And as I mentioned, Dr. Feldman, together with Dr. McGonigle, are co-editors of the book that we are launching today. Our second speaker will be Dr. Ariel Handel, who is a lecturer in political theory and urbanism at the Bezalel Academy for Art and Design in Jerusalem. Dr. Handel published numerous journal papers and book chapters on issues of settler colonialism, space, power, and violence in Israel-Palestine and beyond. He's also co-editor of a volume, Normalizing the Occupation, the Politics of Everyday Life in the West Bank Settlements, that's published and produced by Indiana University Press. Our third speaker today will be Dr. Emily Schneider, the assistant professor in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Northern Arizona University. Dr. Schneider is the author of multiple publications on American Jews, Israel, and peace building. And her research has received funding from agencies including the National Institutes of Health and the NSF, the National Science Foundation. Dr. Schneider's forthcoming book, American Jews in Palestine, Violence and Power in Liberal Settler Colonialism, takes a look at the way Jewish Americans engage with questions of state violence and transnational solidarity through the lens of alternative tourism to the West Bank. Now, last but certainly not least, we are not going to be hearing directly from Dr. McGonigle, the other co-editor of the book, but we are going to be watching a brief segment from a film that Dr. McGonigle produced in connection with the chapter that he contributed to the book. Dr. McGonigle works in Singapore and is currently on a lecture commitment in South Korea in the Far East, so he's unable to join us. But he's sending his warm regards, and we are going to be hearing from him through the medium of the film segment that he shared with us. So without further ado, I would like now to turn the screen and the microphone over to Professor McDowell. Joel, please.
Thank you, Csaba. Very nice to be here, and congratulations on the launch of the book. It sounds terrific. What I'm going to do in the few minutes allotted to me is read from a eulogy that I gave for Hayim at his funeral. He was killed on October 7th, the first day, but the funeral happened only days later because it took time to identify his body and get it cleared. In 2016, I would take the train every week from Tel Aviv to Beersheba, where I taught a small group of graduate students. As the weeks went by, one of them stood out. He was quiet and sometimes looked as if he were disinterested. But when he spoke and wrote, I took notice. It was then that I befriended Hayim and started putting the idea in his head of doing a PhD at the University of Washington in Seattle, which was my home university. To be a successful academic, I think, demands that there be one fundamental question or topic that eats away at you and obsessively drives your research. Hayim had just such an obsession, and it was what made his academic research so original and compelling. His work centered on the religious Zionist sector in Israeli society. Coming from that community himself, he felt that it was often treated in simplistic and undifferentiated ways. He undertook difficult field research, interviewing many people, including those in communities in the South, where people had been resettled after the evacuation of Gush Katif from Gaza Strip in 2005. These are all the villages surrounding Gaza. What he found was religious Zionist communities that were much more diverse than what had been described in previous literature. While the rabbinic leadership in these communities was central to understanding the local dynamics, there was also a surprising divergence by ordinary people from the views and the dictates of the rabbis. Hayim was interested in capturing how social and political life are shaped from the bottom up, from the grassroots. Hayim's academic obsession came from his deep love for and anxiety about Israel. When I suggested he apply for a postdoc in the US, he told me that he did not want to leave Israel again for a long stint. When I suggested he apply for positions in colleges in the north of Israel, he told me that he wanted a position that would allow him to stay on his beloved kibbutz, Cholit. Whether working as a car mechanic or a landscaper, he loved that kibbutz with a passion and talked about it endlessly with me. He, in fact, invited me to come down a number of times, and we talked about such a visit. It never actually happened. His concern for Israel came from his deep belief that Israeli Jews and Palestinians would have to find a way for both to live on this small piece of land in one of the most volatile regions in the world. From playing Israeli and Palestinian music in his role as a DJ to accompanying peace activists in the occupied territories, he modeled a life where Israelis and Palestinians could live side by side and somehow learn to appreciate each other. He studied and feared political ideas that promoted exclusivism. His latest work on the Kohelet Forum and other conservative think tanks in Israel explored where such ideas originated and how they are propagated. We grew close when he was in Seattle. He came to me with his insights and his ideas, and I listened, marveling at how his mind worked and the passion he brought to his research. He was a good soul, and may his soul be bound up in the circle of life.
Thank you very much, Joel. Thank you. Dr. Feldman.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Joel. And I want to thank everyone for being here today. I want to, of course, first express my deep gratitude to Chava and to everyone at the Azrieli Institute for organizing this event and publishing this volume with their joint publishing program with McGill Queen's University Press. Thank you also to Richard, our editor from McGill Queen's Press, who's here today, who supported this project enthusiastically from the beginning. And thank you to my collaborator and co-editor, Ian, who cannot be here with us today, but without whom this project would not have been possible. So we're here to celebrate the launch of our volume, but we do so in a moment of tremendous pain. And we mourn the murder of our dear colleague, Hayim Katsman. So as we've already said, we wish to dedicate this event to Hayim, to honor and celebrate his life. And so before I give you a brief overview of the book and its sort of big picture interventions, I'd also like to say some words about Hayim and his impactful life and the significance of his scholarship. As Joel started to tell us, Hayim was determined to understand the political rise to power of Israel's religious right wing, which he viewed as a serious obstacle to the establishment of a just and lasting peace. What's remarkable that I find in Hayim's work is that even though he disagreed with the ideologies of his interlocutors, he does not blame or demonize individuals in his writing. He presents religious settlers to us in a complex and deeply humanizing manner. He sees them as part of a much bigger matrix of power, inequality, and reciprocal violence that has to be dismantled for the safety and security of all Israelis and Palestinians. It's for this reason that Hayim dedicated his dissertation to, and I quote Hayim, all life forms that exist between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. I think in just that one dissertation dedication, we feel who Hayim was. But Hayim was not just an armchair academic, as I've learned in the weeks since his death. Yes, he was passionate about theorizing a future Israel that could evolve beyond exclusive ideas of Jewish ethno-nationalism. But he was also trying to create this world on the ground, a world in which, I quote Hayim again, Israelis and Palestinians both are able to live full lives as equals under the law, end quote. Hayim embodied the engaged scholar activist. As I've learned in the week since his death, he volunteered to help protect Palestinian farmers in the South Hebron Hills, who are frequently subjected to forms of state-sponsored and settler violence. He volunteered in Rahat, a Bedouin city, and was active with Academia for Equality, an organization supporting Palestinian academics in Israel. Hayim belonged to a small but tremendously courageous cohort of Israelis who dare to cross over physical divides and who dare to surmount the immense mental walls of fear and trauma, to extend a human hand to Palestinians and to affirm multiple narratives of belonging to the land. Thus, I think we can say that Hayim's life was a life marked by profound bravery. Bravery in his intellectual production and his willingness to challenge hegemonic narratives, bravery in his willingness to engage in direct actions, practical actions on the ground that reject a Jewish versus Arab binary, and bravery until his last breath, as we learned when he used his body to shield his neighbor Avital from bullets, ultimately saving her life as well as the lives of 2 children who were released with her and whom she carried home to safety. It was our great honor to work with Hayim and publish his chapter in our volume. He played a critical role in bringing this project to life and in conceptualizing it with us. Hayim's chapter is notably the only chapter that does not focus on the West Bank, but rather he writes about religious settlement in the Chalutza Sands, a region not far from where he was killed. We chose to include his chapter precisely because it provided an interesting counterpoint to the others, highlighting the processes of settler identity construction in a region with no prior record of Jewish settlement. His case study highlights the fact that we cannot simply look at settlement expansion in the West Bank and cordon it off neatly as the problem, while pointing to the moral superiority of Israel proper. His chapter on the Chalutza Sands reminds us, in his chapter on the Chalutza Sands, he reminds us that an ethos of exclusive Jewish domination over the land has never been confined to the West Bank. And if such an ethos continues to exist, it may not be possible to break the cycles of reciprocal violence. In one particularly chilling passage from his chapter, he quotes a woman from one of the dismantled settlements in Gaza, who now lives in Chalutza, who says to him, the ethnographer, "Does that mean I'm back to being a settler? Interesting. Turns out that we are all settlers and they want to burn all of us," end quote. Echoing again this foreboding statement in his chapter, in the very last line of the last essay that Hayim published before his death in the journal Shofar, he wrote, I quote, "As history has shown more than once, ignoring the Palestinian struggle is not a sustainable strategy," end quote. Hayim's publications demonstrate the intellectual and methodological rigor he brought to his work, his deeply sensitive and compassionate nature as a researcher, bearing witness to the stories of others, even those he did not agree with. His work serves as a reminder that we can strive for creative political imagination, even as we sit in our pain and mourn and condemn. And by doing so, by striving for creative political imagination, we honor Hayim's life. Hayim's death is a tremendous and painful loss for our small community of Israel Studies scholars, a community whose desire to produce critical and honest research stems first and foremost from a place of profound love for Israel, as I believe it did for Hayim. As this book travels into readers' hands across the world, we will continue to study Hayim's writings and keep his memory alive. And I hope keep alive his vision of collective liberation for both Israelis and Palestinians. I wish to speak now about the book and briefly summarize some of its content and core interventions before we hear from two other of our authors. I'll try to energetically transition to a different kind of speech here. In 2015, the World Zionist Congress met in Jerusalem and passed a resolution declaring the Jewish people, quote, a Semitic people indigenous to the land of Israel and seeking international recognition of its indigenous status, end quote. In the wake of the resolution, pro-Israel lobby groups have increasingly relied on arguments of Jewish indigeneity, often making comparisons to Native American indigenous struggles to legitimize a Jewish right to the entire biblical land of Israel. At the same time, Israeli settler organizations have responded to international condemnation of the occupation by again mobilizing narratives of Jewish indigeneity, claiming sovereign and divine rights to the land. These groups often use liberal discourses to invert the relationship of settler and native, marking Jews as victimized natives struggling against a, quote, Palestinian occupier. Our volume, Settler Indigeneity in the West Bank, asks what exactly Israeli settlers and settler organizations mean when they say they are, quote, indigenous. How is indigeneity felt, performed, mediated, and what are the implications of claiming Jewish indigeneity on the international stage? In other words, how has this notion that the World Zionist Congress put forth in 2015, this notion of Jewish indigeneity, become a political resource? I want to be very, very clear that this book is not a debate about the relative nativeness of Israelis or Palestinians, because I really fear that it could be easily misconstrued this way. I know that such a debate exists, especially on social media, and that it has flared back up since the war began. So I want to say it again. This book is not a debate about who is more native to the land. In fact, I think one of the things that this book does is demonstrate the ways in which such a debate is fundamentally flawed. First, Jews and Palestinians both have historical connections to this land. To try to argue whose is more valid today ultimately demonizes and dehumanizes either Israelis or Palestinians. And this, I believe, is counterproductive to advancing a vision of equal rights and belonging. Invalidating either Israeli or Palestinian identities does not get us closer to a lasting peace. The second reason why the who is more native debate is fundamentally flawed is that it would require we all agree on a stable or objective notion of who is native to begin with. By what parameters are we going to agree to gauge nativeness in this context? Is it by virtue of being born in the land? One could be native but born abroad. The number of generations in a land, if so, what number is required? Is it a matter of DNA, of language, or culture? All, I guess, could be possible parameters, but we must recognize that their selection and prioritization is an act of social construction. So the idea that there is one objective measure of nativeness has been challenged and deconstructed extensively by scholars working in the field of indigeneity studies, who have deconstructed the very categories of settler and native, demonstrating how they function as co-constituting categories, a particular binary forged within the settler colonial histories of Europe. Building on this important literature, we begin our volume with the premise that concepts like native are not natural categories, but products of colonial encounters and power relations, where natives were defined as such, to quote the words of scholar Kim Tallbear, in opposition to the settlers who encountered them. In other words, the native does not become indigenous or primitive or uncivilized until they stand vis-a-vis the colonizer. Thus, the word indigeneity has historically been used to denote a particular kind of power relation, the native vis-a-vis a dominating colonizer. This historical context of the word indigeneity is precisely why the contemporary phenomenon of organizations promoting Jewish indigeneity is so puzzling and so paradoxical that it warrants close academic analysis. In the case of the West Bank, Jews are claiming indigeneity to validate territorial annexation, even though they, as recent settlers, are clearly positioned on the side of the powerful, as protected citizens under the shelter of the Israeli state. So to investigate this phenomenon, we asked a set of conceptual questions. How can one be both claiming indigeneity and actively settling the land and identifying as a settler at the same time? What exactly is the historical, cultural, and linguistic genealogy of this particular political configuration of Jewish indigeneity that would lead to this 2015 declaration by the World Zionist Organization? How is Jewish indigeneity mobilized as a resource for territorial expansion? How did Jewish settlers imagine their belonging to the land in ways that both resemble and break from other settler colonial projects? And in the words of Reich Zreik, a Palestinian legal theorist who writes the concluding chapter of our volume, when, if ever, does the settler become a native? So we coined this term settler indigeneity because it provocatively highlights the ambiguity and paradox at play. Interestingly, even the Jewish biblical narrative itself underscores this paradox when it describes Judaism's biblical forefather, Abraham, arriving in the promised land and self-identifying as ger v'toshav, I am both outsider and resident. Following the exodus from Egypt, the children of Israel engage in battles of conquest with local populations as they establish their own kingdom. Based on the biblical narrative alone, which is often used by Jewish indigeneity proponents, the ancient land of Canaan was clearly an ethnically and culturally diverse landscape, and the ancient Israelites were one of a number of ancient ethno-national communities to inhabit the land. Today, the English concept of indigenous is most commonly translated into Hebrew as yalid, meaning someone who has been born in a given place. Translating indigeneity as yalid, again, interestingly, misses the broader lexical use of the word indigeneity in English, which implies a certain kind of power relation and a population that has been dominated by a more powerful colonizing nation that exerts its cultural, economic, political, and religious hegemony in the native's ancestral land. So even the existing Hebrew terminology is interestingly at odds with the ways in which indigeneity is imagined and mobilized as a transnational discursive category. Again, I want to be very clear that in thinking about Jewish indigeneity as a contemporary social construction, we are not denying the historical Jewish connection to the land of Israel. Rather, what we are doing is trying to ask seriously and sincerely what indigeneity claims are doing culturally on a communal level and politically on the world stage. We're interested in thinking about indigeneity not as an essence, but as a process, to see in Jewish indigeneity claims as a set of evolving practices. While our book focuses on the contemporary moment, I want to make it clear that there is, of course, a much longer history of Zionist indigeneity making that dates back to the 19th century, with social and political programs aimed at transforming the diasporic Jew into the native Israeli, a process that also required the erasure of Jewish ethnic difference. We address this very well-researched history in the introduction. I don't have time to recap it all here. We also address in the introduction the role of intra-Jewish racial dynamics and how the historical production of a Jewish versus Arab binary is critical to understanding just how settler indigeneity works today. A final point that I want to address is the question of the settler colonial studies paradigm in relationship to Israel studies. We address this question throughout the book in each chapter, but I want to name it now because I know it's an issue on people's minds and that it can often be a challenging and emotional conversation. Those who have objected to settler colonial theory informing the academic study of Israel often claim that the Israel-Palestine conflict is beyond historical comparison, and moreover, that any attempts to compare Zionism to European colonial projects amounts to a form of anti-Semitism and a denial of the Jewish right to self-determination. In putting together this volume, we took the stance that it's possible to affirm a historic Jewish connection to the land of Israel and the uniqueness of Zionism, while also attending honestly to its colonial manifestations in terms of the specific modes of political thought and specific modalities of control over land, resources, and Palestinian populations, and to do it in a way that does not simplistically equate all historical cases of settler colonialism. In our volume, we try to describe and understand a form of colonialism in which the settler attempts to become more native than the local people, morally and epistemically, through the specific practices that we document in our chapters, using the methodologies of ethnographic research. With a viewpoint from the ground, each chapter reveals a range of indigenizing practices, including but not limited to the revival of biblical religious rituals, new forms of tourism, the fusion of traditional Judaism with New Age spirituality, new agricultural practices, winemaking, and mimicry of Palestinians. In my own chapter, for example, I present fieldwork that I conducted in a women's seminary in the West Bank, where Jewish women are socialized into a messianic settler ideology and come to see themselves not as Jews, but as, quote, women from the tribe of Judah, in the words of one of my interlocutors. So to wrap up, what I believe ethnography allows us to do in this book is to understand how settler colonialism works in the West Bank, while simultaneously reminding us that there are real, complex human people inside of these power structures. Humanizing settlers does not need to imply a normalization of the daily injustices that Palestinians face. On the contrary, humanizing while still attending to power and injustice, I believe, allows us to work toward a future vision of collective liberation.
So thank you for inviting me here, and it's a happy and sad event, and I think that all of us in Israel and beyond are in this state of something that is sitting on all of us in the last weeks, and as Rachel said, Hayim's chapter was really prophetic in a very spooky way, quoting letters from Hamas talking about killing settlers within Israel around Gaza. And in the 10 minutes that I have, I would like to talk about the question of dealing with of using settler colonialism now after October 7th, and to ask several questions, because I think that they are very important for all of us. Myself using this analytic framework for a few years now, and it's a question of responsibility. I think of a double responsibility, if I may. One is the responsibility of using titles or concepts that might be used or understood as a license to violence, maybe. But also the question of our responsibility as scholars towards the academic discourse, meaning how can we still use this framework of settler colonialism, of talking about decolonization, of asking about historical narratives and cases, and how can we still use those concepts, but maybe fine-tune them or ask about their relevancy to the case of Israel-Palestine. And it means, for example, that we need to ask whether settler colonialism is an analytic framework or also a call for political action, that is to decolonize. Because if we talk about colonization, so justice is to decolonize. And then the question is, what decolonization? Not as a metaphor, okay, just to take this a title of a highly quoted academic paper that now turned into some kind of a slogan, like saying, what did you expect? Decolonization is not a metaphor. It's something that is very real. So how do we actually treat it? And also mentioning that Elon Musk declared a few days ago that it is not allowed to use the word decolonization on X, on Twitter, because, I quote, it is a euphemism to genocide. So is decolonization necessarily a euphemism to genocide? If so, how can we use it as scholars? If not, then what does it mean? So we can, generally speaking, say that there are two different approaches to the study of settler colonialism, or to define what settler colonialism is. The first starts from the end, meaning that settler colonialism is what happened in a place where settlers succeeded, okay, when the story is complete. In Canada, the US, Australia, New Zealand, etc., that the settler colonialism means that actually a history ended, okay, for the colonized. The colonizers have won, and that the power relations are very clear, and in other narrative, other approach, settler colonialism is about practices and about motives, and you can talk about degrees of settler colonialism. And then it means that settler colonialism is not about the question whether it has succeeded in eliminating the native, whatever this elimination means, but rather to talk about the effort to build a home in the territory on the expense of other people's home, to self-indigenize, to the logic of replacement that Wolf is talking about. And therefore, if we talk about degrees of decolonization without asking about their success or insuccess, then we can talk about different types of settler colonialisms in the plural. And then maybe one way of asking about different kinds of settler colonialisms is through the question of decolonization, meaning what does it mean to decolonize a settler colony? Because we do know what does it mean to decolonize in classic colonialism. Okay, it means that the colonizers need to leave the territory for good. But then if we see, for example, Algiers as a kind of settler colonialism, so we can say that by keeping the relations to the motherland, to France, by having another place to go to, decolonization was possible without genocide, without erasing the settler colony, the settler society altogether. While in other places, we can say that settler colonialism has succeeded in a way that people really don't have any place to go to, that both populations have created a home in the territory in a way that that means that decolonizing is actually negating one's place, home, and even existence. And that means that if we go to speak now about Israel-Palestine, and we would like to ask what settler colonialism means in Israel-Palestine. So if you ask Palestinians many times, they will say that settler colonialism is from 1948 onwards, and the occupation in 1967 is only another stage in the story, and therefore there is no difference between Cholit, where Hayim was living, and I don't know, Gush Katif or Ofra or any other settlement in the occupied territories. On the other hand, if we look at it from a left Zionist perspective, so there is a huge difference between 48 and 67, between the official Israel and the occupied territories. And what I would like to suggest is that the difference between 48 and 67 can be done through the question of decolonization or through the degrees of settler colonialism within it. And the question, do people have a place to go to or not? Now, this is not only a question of whether we justify decolonization that leads to extreme violence, but also to ask about the issue of the book that is Settler Indigeneity in the West Bank. I think that the fact that the settlers within the West Bank know that they have another place to go to is part of the story, meaning that their self-effort of self-indigenizing, the thing that is studied through the different chapters within this really fascinating book, is about people that need to stress their indigeneity in a way that they know, most of them, that their existence in the place is always in question. And if it is in question, then you have to do some work in order to justify, in order to self-legitimize, to legitimize yourself in front of other Israelis, in front of the world, etc., etc. And I think that in that sense, this division between the West Bank and, let's say, Israel proper in the 1948 territory is important. And I'd like to just refer in 2 minutes to our own chapter, which I wrote with Daniel Monterescu and Rafi Grossblick. So we went to interview and to research organic farmers in the Jewish settlements in the West Bank, assuming that this group of people, that it is important to speak with them and to understand their practices of working the land, avodat ha'adama in Hebrew, which is very important in Zionist history. But being organic means that they belong to 2 different discourses. One is, if you wish, hippie leftist, inclusive way of thinking about environmental justice and about thinking of the health of the soil and the health of the community, etc., etc. And the other is about the organic connection to the land, to the soil, that in their view is quite related to the concept of blood and soil. It means seeking for authenticity, for a very strong connection with the land, and then we spoke with quite many farmers, and we saw that they speak in different terms. So we divided them to 3 analytical concepts The first is territory. Territory means that people want to territorialize, to widen their borders, to catch as much land as possible, to settle down in the way that we think about settlements in the West Bank, like taking more and more land. Others talked about soil, about the romantic connection to the earth, to the soil, to the holy soil of the Holy Land, and they spoke theology when they talked about agriculture, and so their way of indigeneity was to tie themselves into the soil and to prove that this soil can be cultivated, truly cultivated, only by Jews, by Jew believers like them. And then the third concept was land as a capitalist, neoliberal sometimes way of making business, selling stuff. They didn't even ask. When we came to ask them, they told us very quickly, did you come to speak about politics or about agriculture? Because we don't do politics here. We just we sell stuff. We just grow things. And looking at it analytically, it looks the least political way of living in the West Bank, but taking again the settler colonial framework, which means that it succeeds the most when people normalize their existence in the land, that you don't even have to ask anymore, why am I here? What am I doing here? How can I justify it? But I just live here. This is normal. This is natural. So maybe they signify the last stage in this way of self-indigenizing into the land of the West Bank. So, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for helping us think further about the concept of settler indigeneity in such a creative and thought-provoking fashion. Thank you. And our next speaker is Emily.
Great. Hi, everyone. I have a PowerPoint, so I'm thinking I may unpin the other speakers just so that people can see the text on the screen, and then can bring everyone back. All right, so I'm just going to share my screen here. Okay, can everyone see that? Yes?
Yeah, perfect.
So, great. So I'm Emily Schneider. I'm an assistant professor at Northern Arizona University, and I'm going to be presenting on my chapter from the book, and I'll be drawing a few linkages today to the current situation in Israel. So I've gone through and kind of taken what my main conclusions were and thought about ways that we could apply them today. So the name of my chapter is Negotiating Indigeneity in Hebron, Criminality, Tourism, and Liberal Settler Colonialism. And my chapter actually looks at how American Jews respond to West Bank settlers' claims when they go on tours like Breaking the Silence or other anti-occupation tours to really get at these three research questions. So the first question is, how do liberal American Jews respond to West Bank settlers' claims of indigeneity? How do liberal American Jews account for questions of indigeneity and settler colonialism and their conceptualizations of Israel-Palestine? And then finally, what does this reveal about the ways that neoliberalism and militarism are infused into social justice activism and identity politics? And so just to give a little bit of the background and the literature that I use. So the literature that I drew from were from scholars that are listed here below, who basically argue that liberalism is a key element of settler colonialism. And we often hear about sort of the incongruence, right, of liberalism and Zionism. But what I'm going to argue today is that one of kind of the missing pieces in this is understanding that Zionism is actually very much in line with liberalism in many ways. And so this happens because we see that liberal governance under settler colonialism, as Ariel kind of alluded to, relies upon this displacement and erasure of the native population, whether that's through genocide, like in a place like the United States, or through assimilation, which would also be more in line with the United States. And along with that, in order for that erasure to happen, we have different types of dehumanization that occur. And so that dehumanization is often accomplished through different types of tropes and narratives related to the Native people as being more primitive or more savage, and using ideas around Orientalism and other types of dehumanization to basically justify that structural displacement. And so because of this, liberalism then upholds whiteness, it upholds white supremacy, it uses capitalism and capitalist individualism to basically justify this displacement and this assimilation as if it's taking us on a path towards progress and peace. And there's various scholars who have written about this. I'm definitely not the first person to talk about this, and you can see their works listed below. Several scholars have also particularly talked about this in the context of Zionism and how liberal Zionists will distinguish themselves from West Bank settlers to obscure their own role in settler colonialism. And so my chapter looks specifically at the case of Hebron. Hebron is one of the largest Palestinian cities in the West Bank with 215,000 Palestinians, but it's also a place with about 800 right-wing religious settlers. And it's one of the only Palestinian cities where you actually have Israeli settlers from in the West Bank living within the city itself. And so this creates a very complex relationship, both between the soldiers and the settlers there, but also between the Palestinians and the Israeli settlers living there because it's so congested. It's one of the places where you see lots of different tours coming there because on the one hand, you have the high level of religious significance to Jewish people and also to Muslims and to other religions as well. But from the left-wing perspective, from these anti-occupation tours, it's really a flashpoint of tensions and a very stark representation of the occupation because it's so condensed and because the settlers are living within the city rather than on hilltops outside of the city. And so what I did was I looked at the tours that are going on in Hebron, mostly anti-occupation tours, but also some of the right-wing settler tours as well, to basically understand how American Jews and tourists who go on these tours respond to these competing claims of indigeneity that are being professed by both the Palestinians and the Israelis living there. And so I conducted several years of participant observation as well as interviews with the people who went on these tours and tour organizers. And I focused specifically on two main organizations, Breaking the Silence, which many of you are probably familiar with, Shobrim Shtika, and then Walls to Windows, which is an organization that I actually started when I was living in Israel at the time. And so these tours take these mostly, groups of American Jews that I looked at to places like the Goldstein Grave, which is the site of a massacre that happened where Baruch Goldstein, an American-born Israeli settler in Hebron, murdered 29 people inside the Ibrahimi Mosque in 1994. They also take people to Shuhada Street, which is a street where Palestinians are not allowed to exit basically from their homes right now, actually because of what's going on. And they've been pretty much, barred from using the streets and the rooms, the place in front of their houses. And so we also see things like graffiti on Palestinian buildings from settlers. There's different types of violence that happens there that sometimes tourists witness, as well as lots of closures and checkpoints and just kind of the staple elements of the occupation in the West Bank. And again, it's very condensed and very visceral because it's in this small territory. And so today I'm going to be talking about how tourists responded to these tours and what that tells us about this deeper kind of question of indigeneity and settler colonialism in Israel-Palestine, as Rachel and Ariel so beautifully explained. And so to begin, what we see, our settlers are basically starting off by talking about their ancient connections to the land. As we've discussed, they will invoke the different biblical and historical elements of Jewish indigeneity in the region. But what's most interesting is that they also present themselves as being victims of terrorism, of state-sanctioned violence, and most notably theft. And you can see here, this is one of the signs from the Jewish community in Hebron that hang along the route of these anti-occupation tours. It says, these buildings were constructed in land purchased by the Hebron Jewish community in 1807. This land was stolen by Arabs following the murder of 67 Hebron Jews in 1929. We demand justice, return our property to us. And so what we really see is this kind of merging of an indigenous victimhood, while at the same time still upholding elements of colonial rule like capitalism and also aspects of the colonial state. So they do not present themselves as victims of colonialism, but yet they present themselves as indigenous. And this is because they benefit from the different apparatuses of settler colonialism and capitalism within the region. And so tourist American Jewish liberals basically reject these claims of victimization. They don't buy into them. They see, Jewish nationalism in the West Bank as more exclusionary and as illiberal when they go on these tours. And they basically switch from seeing these settlers, from these Israelis, as no longer being victims of terrorism, but actually perpetrators of terrorism and ethnic violence and exclusion. The other thing, though, that we see in addition to this is that the liberal Jews who go on these tours also talk about the settlers as being morally deficient. And so one example of this from the book was someone who I interviewed who said, if we could just switch out the Hebron settlers with Israelis or Jews of higher character, then we wouldn't have this problem. And so what we see is this real disdain for the settlers in light of a simultaneous legitimization of the Israeli state. So people will say things like, these people are not Israelis, or the Hebron settlers justify or jeopardize Israel's security. And we even see people talking about having more sympathy for the IDF after going on these tours because they see them as also victims of these radical settlers, settler colonialism. Another theme that came up in my discussions was this emphasis on lawlessness, where they focus on settlers as obstructing the legal and ethical aspects of Israeli domination, and basically looking to the IDF as the entity that could discipline the settlers and contain their colonialism. And so this brings up some obvious interesting questions, right, in terms of this distinction between 48 and 67 that Ariel alluded to. And so to summarize, what these people have in their minds as they're reacting to these tours is they're taking the moral character of individual settlers as the main issue at play, and then also simultaneously upholding the legitimacy of Israeli state institutions, whether that be the military or their criminal justice systems. And so in that sense, the problem is not tied to colonization. It's actually seen as a criminal issue versus a systemic issue, which then sustains some of the most effective elements of settler colonialism, as argued by scholars such as Mamdani. And so if we think about it this way, right, the criminal justice framework is not going to actually upset the power arrangements that are at play because it preserves the military and the state as the entities that need to be in charge in this situation. In other words, people who go on these tours are not bothered by Israel being in a position of power necessarily. They're instead more disturbed by the ways that settlers obstruct the legitimized and legal pillars of Israeli domination. And so this leads to my conclusion, which Rachel also talked about, was basically that liberals often see indigeneity as a power relation. They accept Palestinians' indigeneity. So these same people that go on these tours also will go to a place like Ida refugee camp there in the bottom, and they will accept Palestinians as being indigenous, and they'll talk about them as being indigenous, but they will not talk about the Hebron settlers as being indigenous. They see Hebron settlers as being anti-modern. They say they're just the same as the Muslim extremists, which then shows us, right, these kind of racialized tropes of barbarity that are actually in play in the same way against the settlers as they were in play previously against Palestinians to justify, them being as sort of more primitive or that rhetoric around savagery. And so in this sense, Palestinians can be indigenous because of their disempowerment. So to these tourist minds, the indigenous people are indigenous because they're colonized, because they're victims. In contrast, settlers' claims of indigeneity are not accepted, and they instead push liberal activists to invoke the legitimacy of the state to contain and control them. And so if we relate this to what's going on today, we can see that the world largely sees Palestinians as indigenous and Israelis as colonizers, despite both groups having connections to the land. And so this tells us, right, that it's not really about chronology for people who hold this paradigm in play or existing or historical ties, but it's actually much more about power and victimization. And so this leads to another section that I wrote in the book, which is about the benevolent colonizer and this issue of decolonization as a metaphor. And right, it reveals again how liberals tend to equate indigeneity with powerlessness, and therefore that leads them to treat decolonization as a metaphor, which maybe people have heard in different discussions or at protests and that kind of thing. So the opposition to settlers in Hebron is then not about uplifting indigenous rights, since they don't actually care that much about indigeneity. Instead, it's a protective response to the destabilization of liberal colonialism. Liberal selective outrage against West Bank settlers then allows them to uphold the indigeneity of Palestinians while securing their own continued benefits from the settler colonial state. Ultimately, liberals will align, though, with the current arrangements of power, especially in terms of violence that affects them. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing now in terms of so many Jews and Israelis being united with Israel right now, because it's going to last until the violence is actually in play in a way that feels threatening. Liberal Americans criticizing Israel, but not the US, are engaging in the same type of thinking. They rely on the human rights framework and liberal values to maintain their own positions of power in the US through scapegoating what they see as less civilized and more violent manifestations of settler colonialism. And so this is not something I talked about in the book, but I think is an interesting point to discuss today, is why there is this sort of incongruence between, most American Jews and most Israelis, and then some other liberals in the United States who are criticizing the state of Israel, but maybe not willing to think about decolonization in the United States. So finally, for my conclusions, what we can gather from this is that epistemological support for settler colonialism is covertly sustained through the application of liberal paradigms to justify state violence. And it's actually an adherence to liberalism and to the legitimacy of state violence, not co-optations of indigenousness, that lie at the heart of ideological barriers to decolonization. And I get to this conclusion by basically demonstrating through my chapter that the Israeli state maintains its power not through claims of indigeneity, but through strengthening its liberal modes of governance and its alliance with Western powers and liberalism. So to claim to be indigenous doesn't actually get you anywhere in our global world order, if you think about it, because being indigenous, right, is largely contained to this kind of symbolic conceptualization. That tells us then, right, if we look at today's violence, that there's these contradictions going on in terms of the liberal indigeneity discourse, as you can see in the signs here. And what we need to think about is that Israel is a manifestation of Western liberalism. It's not actually an anomaly, as some people like to present it. And that then leads us to this question of whether progressives should stand on the side of liberalism, which requires militarization and displacement, as history has shown us in terms of the history of assimilation and genocide in the United States, or should we embrace a more radical politics of true decolonization, which I would argue would require anti-capitalism and demilitarization. So thank you all. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Emily. So the first question that we have is from Shoshana Berry. And Shoshana's question is as follows. How do you see the tendency to describe the Israelis as the crusaders that came from Europe, or as victims of the Holocaust done by Europeans? So rather than reading out some of the questions in batches, I try to give maybe our panelists an opportunity to respond and react to each.
Okay, so I'm hearing a question that there's people who try to compare Israelis to European crusaders. Okay. First of all, I think that's a really sloppy historical comparison. It's a lazy historical comparison. I think that comparative historical work is really important. I think it's something we're obviously committed to, and we're thinking about the question of settler colonialism. But we cannot just approach it in a simplistic and lazy way. I don't think that any good scholar of settler colonialism, respected scholar of settler colonialism, has ever tried to say that every case of conquest is equivalent, or even any case of colonialism is equivalent. They all are unique and must be nuanced and understood. And I think that someone who would make a claim like that has a particular political agenda, of course. I think something that, to answer the question, I can't recap the whole history of Zionism now, but just to say that we tried in our introduction to provide a kind of gloss of some of the most important literature on the history of Zionism that looks at Zionism as a phenomenon that was in its origins both national and colonial at the same time. It's possible to understand it this way. Jews did not have a home empire. There's no home empire from which they are colonizing or can return to. This is unique. The early waves of Zionist immigration were about escaping persecution, about trying to find an answer to the Jewish question, and the inability of the modern European nation states to fully accept Jews as equal citizens. This is unique. But at the same time, the founding thinkers of Zionism also, in addition to articulating a nationalist project, saw what they were doing as a colonizing and civilizing venture, and they used those terms in their writing, in the foundational writings. If we read Herzl, if we read Jabotinsky, they're speaking about colonizing project, and unfortunately they were subject to the modalities of European thought of the time, which did not look down on colonialism as a bad thing. They were subjected to ideas, Orientalist ideas, that looked at Palestinians as primitive people who could not possibly have a sovereign imagination of their own, and they carried those ideas with them. So I would just say in response to that question that that's not a historical comparison I would make, but that I would encourage anyone who wants to think about the combined national and colonial origins of Zionism to read the introduction, and if you want to go deeper, to check out the citations in the introduction, where we have a pretty robust list of scholars that one could read. I don't know if Ariel or Emily, you want to add anything to what I said.
Yeah, Emily, please.
Emily, go ahead.
Okay. I think all that I would add is that when I'm looking at the question now in the chat in terms of being victims of the Crusades, or victims of, or Palestinians as victims of the Holocaust, I think was the implication there. And I would argue that, we have to understand the current violence against Israelis as also rooted in these I would maybe say there is some linkage there in terms of understanding that the Holocaust, the Crusades, all these different historical, events are things that happened because of exclusionary types of violence that were based in different types of ethno-religious, ideas of supremacy, whether that was white supremacy or whether it's Christian supremacy. And so I think that then hints right at the roots of some of this, which are ideas around different ethnic groups being more important, their lives being more important. And so in that sense, I really see, Israelis as in many ways victims of this, because we can find the roots in European, Christian hegemony and European imperialism. And so when we go back to those roots, I think in a lot of ways we can think about Israelis and Jews as cannon fodder, right, of these different groups and of these different kinds of historical violence, if we look back, right, historically in terms of imperialism. And so in many ways, I think those analogies are not accurate, but they are helpful in terms of understanding kind of the historical precedent of primarily Europeans, right, carrying out this type of ethnic violence in the name of either Christian or white supremacy. And then Zionism being in some ways part of that, but it was a response, right, to those different types of exclusion. And so if we keep going back to the roots, right, we can understand that is the root of this violence in a way too. It goes back to the fact that Jews were not included in Europe and they were violently killed. And that's part of how we ended up here.
Ariel, any comments or reflection on?
No, I don't think that I have something to add on this question.
So before jumping to the next question, let me throw in one of my own, and actually maybe two. And one of them is perhaps less interesting than the other, but I will still venture. And I want to pick up on a very important point, Rachel, that you suggested, and you pointed to the biblical origins and connections, and you I think, very, very eloquently problematized the Abrahamic story and the mission and Ger Vetoshav, the complexity of that. Now, a counterfactual occurs to me. What would the book tell us? Or what would we have even conceived of the book if the Uganda scheme had worked? Right? And I'm asking this question because the Zionists went to Palestine, the land of Israel, for the reasons that you mentioned. There were other possibilities. Herzl talked about Argentina, Uganda came up, and Arish, but this is where they are. So there is a deeper historical, religious connection that you cannot abstract away from. How important is it in all these discussions? And I guess that's the bigger of the two questions. Any reactions?
I guess, I don't know if I have a perfect answer, but my first reaction is just to say that I think that we can put the question of Jewish indigeneity in question. We can hold that in a place of tension in question and say that, yes, of course, Jews have a profound connection to this landscape, and that predates Zionism, right? There has always been periodic, episodic Jewish immigration to Palestine through antiquity, through the Middle Ages. There's Jews are making pilgrimages. They want to come back to this land to be buried there. This is part of Jewish history. It never stopped, but the idea of conquesting this land and establishing an exclusive Jewish sovereignty there,
That's right.
and the use of an indigeneity discourse to justify that kind of exclusive sovereignty, that's something different. That is something different than the rich tradition of Jewish connection to this land. And in writing this book, I'm trying to pull apart those two things and let them both exist.
And it's a very difficult test, but that's a wonderful answer. Thank you. Thank you for engaging that.
It's a good question. Yeah.
Ariel, Emily, any reactions?
Well, I can refer maybe to Davida's question on the chat.
Yeah.
That I think that is relevant to all of the discussion that goes on here. So I'd like just to refer to it, to the question whether it is the time to talk about nuances. And I think that this is the most important question, and the most important thing that we do here today, and that the book is doing, and it also relates to the question that have been discussed already. I think that we must talk about nuances, that we always have to talk about nuances. There is this phrase saying that the first victim in war is truth, or something like that. But we have truths. We have too many truths. Okay, it is true that you cannot murder citizens, civilians. It is true that what happened is part of a context. It is true that Israel is occupying. It is true that both parties have connections to the land. Everything is true. And now the question is, what can we do with it, and how do we think with nuances? And therefore, I think that that this is part of the responsibility that we have, and therefore understanding, for example, that the Crusaders are a historic reference that makes some kind of work in the world. Okay, it means something to people, so we need to address it not as something that is factually wrong. So, if we just prove that it's factually wrong, or that, I don't know, God promised us the land and not them, and that we've been here for X years and they for Y, it doesn't help us. I think that we need to treat all those narratives as part of the of an economy of narratives that are important in order to say, yeah, there is a Jewish historical connection, and of course that Palestinians lived here, and therefore I think that truth is important, but we need to remember that every community is imagined not in the sense that it is only imagined as as a lie, but that there is a shared image, that images are important, and therefore I think that the question is, how do we make narratives live together? How can we really listen to the other side? How can we use history as a way to share the territory, and not to prove whose narrative is truer in a way, because then we will never end it. And I'm I allow myself to say, talking from Israel Palestine. Okay, this is, I think, the most important thing.
We have about another 5 questions already in the chat. So with your permission, I'm going to draw the line there, because I would rather that we engage each of them, and then we do have to wrap up as we get closer to 2 o'clock. And before I will turn to the next question, which is addressed to Emily, I do want to remind everyone that McGill Queen's University Press offered a very generous 30% discount on the book for anyone who is registered for the event today. So we'll be sure to circulate the details later on. So please buy and read the book and engage the authors in further discussion. So question for Emily in particular, and the question is from Itamar Haritan. I was really fascinated by the discussion of how both settlers and Palestinians are racialized by US Jews in different ways. Could you speak to how these different racializations are related to each other?
Sure. Thanks, Itamar. So I sort of alluded to this a little bit in my presentation. I think where it's been really, I did another talk recently where I basically talked about the conflation of Zionism with white supremacy and whether that's an accurate comparison to make. And someone basically said to me, I don't think it's white supremacy. I think it's Jewish supremacy. And I thought a lot about that question and tried to think how I would answer that. And I think this relates then to Itamar's, which is basically that we have to think about ethnicity as constructed, right? Race and ethnicity as social construct, which is kind of the basis of all social sciences. And so in that sense, that then leads us to the kind of this question of whether Jews are operating as white people in the context of Israel-Palestine, and then how that relates back to more essentialist ideas of whiteness, on a global scale. And what I think we can tell right from this analysis and this comparison is that it's not simply Jewish supremacy, right? There is an element of whiteness in it because it's operating in conjunction with all of these other white Western states in order to carry out violence against Palestinians. And so that tells us then that there's maybe a merging of whiteness with Jewish identity in Israel that is not going to fit neatly into US racial politics, but does tell us a bit about how our different racialized identities can relate to power. And if we think of whiteness not as something essential, but as something defined by power, then we can start to see how whiteness comes into play here. At the same time, though, right, we also have to look at the ways that the anti-Semitism is operating in the United States and Islamophobia is operating in the United States. And I think both of those things are alive and well right now. And I think we can really draw that to this kind of othering that happens of Jews and of Palestinians, where Jews are not seen as fully white, especially in the United States. And there's a long history of that. And so we can see the parallels here with Islamophobia and with anti-Semitism as being kind of that continuing of right-wing white nationalism within the United States that sees these two groups as outside the bounds of whiteness within the United States. And so there's these two kind of contradictory things going on at once, but yet I think they all come down to this othering and this kind of idea of white supremacy. And we can see how they function differently in different contexts, but at their core, the root is a adherence to this idea that white people should be in power, white people are more enlightened. And you can see that in some of the anti-Semitism, I think, in how people talk about Jews and how people talk about Palestinians. And at the end of the day, I think that's how that dehumanization happens, both in terms of Palestinians being dehumanized, but also potentially in terms of Israelis being dehumanized in the way that I talked about it, with US liberals being able to say, well, those are just those, barbaric people in the Middle East who kill each other, rather than seeing it as human lives that are being, killed right now.
Can I add one quick point?
Sure.
So something that might be interesting, Itamar, in my chapter on these women in the seminary, I look at actually Ashkenazi Jewish American women who come to become settlers, who come to become religious and make aliyah to Israel and move to the West Bank. And one of the things that came up in my interviews, you can read about it in the chapter, was the idea that becoming a religious settler, embracing a kind of non-liberal, non-Western Jewish feminism was seen as an antidote to whiteness. Was seen as an antidote to the becoming white people that happened to their parents and grandparents in America. So I think there's a much bigger story here about how gender and also race interact with the indigenizing processes.
Thank you. The next question is for Ariel. And the question is raised by Lauren Fisher. Ariel, you mentioned the term genocide in the beginning of your talk, which is something that Lawrence students are talking about a lot these days. To what extent do you think genocide is an accurate or helpful term in explaining what is happening in this moment? What theoretical frameworks would help us answer this question? And what would those theoretical frameworks actually offer us? Question about genocide and the present context.
Yeah, so thank you for the question. I personally feel that genocide is a very non-useful term in the moment. I think that it has no analytical power. It is when I referred to the question of genocide, I didn't refer to the question whether this is what Hamas was doing in October 7th, or is it what is happening today in the Israeli attack on Gaza Strip, but rather that this is the very extreme end of negating one's right to exist in any place in the world. Okay, because if you say you cannot be here, but you don't have any other place to go to, from both sides, okay, from the colonizers to the colonized, from the colonized to the colonizers in every settler colony or colony that you wish to speak about, then it might end in a genocide. So it's only in this way that I meant it, and I really don't think that it's helpful to argue now whether genocide is happening in Gaza or in Otef Gaza. In both cases, I think that the clear answer is no.
Next question. Thank you, Ariel. The next question is raised by Mikhail Turkevich, and the question goes as follows. Does the more subtle understanding of Zionism make any difference to Palestinians? For many of them, it's the colonial dimension that matters, is it not? General questions?
My first reaction is we cannot speak about one Palestinian opinion. I think that's impossible to answer. There's many Palestinian opinions. All I would say is we have to read Palestinians writing about this topic. And I think the concluding chapter of our topic, written by a Palestinian legal theorist, which is absolutely a chapter engaging with the nuances of Zionism, would be a great place to start to begin thinking about that question.
Great answer. Emily, Ariel, do you want to add, or shall we move to the next question?
I was just trying to find the question. So is the question whether explaining and putting more emphasis on the nuance around Zionism to Palestinians would improve things?
Whether it matters. How do you think Palestinians, and as Rachel said, it's really the plural.
Yeah, sorry, yeah.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I do think that there is value. I think this is less about what Palestinians think, but more about understanding our own relationships as Jews to Zionism, reviving and looking at ways that Zionism could be anti-colonial, and trying to understand if there is a place to have Zionism that is not dependent on settler colonialism. And so there's a history, right, of cultural Zionism and binational Zionism and different types of Zionism that are not inherently settler colonial. And so I think in that sense, first, the work has to come of actually engaging with those ideas and making them viable, because I agree that no Palestinian is going to accept Zionism if it's at their own expense and at their own, loss of land and as victims of settler colonialism. And so that's I think it's not realistic to expect any Palestinian to accept Zionism if it means that they become, ethnically cleansed and victims of settler colonialism. So the question then I think is on Jews and Israelis to say, what does Zionism look like without that relationship? And then might we be able to build partnerships with Palestinians that are based in this kind of reimagining of Zionism that doesn't depend on their expulsion?
Thank you, Emily. And one more question from the chat. And the last question, the member in the audience and is asking to raise the question directly. So we'll move to that in a moment. But the next question is then by Mariam Griffin. And the question is first and foremost addressed to Ariel, but with an invitation to Rachel and Emily also to weigh in. So Mariam would like to hear from Ariel about distinguishing 1948 and 1967 through the prism of decolonization. If we inquire about decolonization through the question of, do the colonizers have somewhere else to go? What does this mean for the future of settler colonialism projects like the US, Canada, and Australia, which are far from quote-unquote complete? So,
I might refer to this letter that I saw a couple of days ago of scholars from Canada talking about Palestine, about Gaza, and it starts with "we, the undersigned, residing in so-called Canada." Now, I think it's, I don't know, I thought of Marx talking about first time as a tragedy and second as a farce. And it's not to go to any way of ridiculizing the question of settler colonialism in Canada, or to say, well, how can you in Canada say something? But I think that it touches the question of whether decolonization is a metaphor or not. In this statement, decolonization is a metaphor. Okay, what does it mean to say residing in so-called Canada? It says nothing, I think. Okay, and correct me if I'm wrong. You don't give up any privileges. You don't do anything but, declaring that it's not a real state, but rather a colony. Okay, end. But in Israel-Palestine, these questions are very acute, and they are theoretical and practical, political and moral. So I think that the question what decolonization means, I think that we can separate between places. It means that, at least as I see it, okay, this is my own political view, there are places that are now applying active violence of expansion and attempt of elimination and occupation, etc., etc. And then I think that decolonization, full decolonization, is definitely what is on the table. On other places where people do not have a place to go to, we need to think about different ways of decolonization that, if I will take from Raif Zreik that was mentioned here. So he gives a list of necessary conditions to do it. So first, the settler is no longer a settler when he sits down, okay, and stops settling. So I think that just open an Israeli newspaper or a media in every single day, and you will find expansionist Zionist practices in 1948 and in 1967 in the Negev and in the Galil and in the West Bank, and you see the laws of planning and building, etc., etc. So this is one thing that needs to be changed if you think about decolonization in 1948. The settler, second, says Zreik, must give up all privileges, okay, that is given by law, etc., etc. We need to think about settlement in the means of compensation, in the means of rethinking how power and lands are now distributed within Israel-Palestine. So we can think about decolonization, and then this maybe answers also to the question of US, Canada, Australia, etc. We can change the basic logics of how we distribute lands, how we distribute resources, rather than just using it as empty words. And then I think that we need to take very seriously the question of how Palestinians see it and how Israelis see it, and how to sit and talk together. And I think that the Raif Zreik's text is a must read in this in that regard for all of us.
Thank you very much, Ariel. Anything to add by Emily or
Ariel?
Yeah.
I'll just add in, I think that there's this conflation of decolonization with this very essentialist idea of identity and race and ethnicity. And I think it's important to remember that just like colonization is a political process, decolonization is also a political process. It's something based in power, not based in people. And so, to Palestinians, Israelis represent power structures to them, right? And Israelis are in congruence, right, with the United States and other powerful entities that are promoting different types of militarism and violence violence. And so in that sense, it really, an actual process of decolonization, in my mind, does not have anything to do with the identities of the people that live there. It has to do with the people that live there being tied to different forms of power and violence. And so, I think I would agree with a lot of what Ariel said, but also just to remind us, right, that these identities are not entrenched, right? They are not inherent. And they are things that are socially constructed. And so if we can remember that and keep that at the center of our understanding of what decolonization is, it means that there is no need for people to leave. They only would have to leave in these historical examples because they were representatives of a state that was engaged in violence. And so I think in that sense, we can really pull the two together and understand both people's ties to the land and also have a process of decolonization that does not displace anybody.
Thank you, Emily. And the last question belongs to Gabi Kirk, who would like to raise the question directly to the members of the panel.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this. Mazel tov. Really glad to see it out. Really powerful to hear your dedications and Hayim's memory. So I have a couple questions, and then I'm going to take some collegial privilege and offer a brief comment as well. So my questions are, the first one, and especially I thought of this when Ariel was you were describing your co-authored chapter about organic farming. How do any of the chapters in the book do or do not deal with the questions of indigeneity as a racialization that happens as a biological claim, like a biocultural claim, claims that like indigenous bodies are physically different bodies that do different things than settlers' bodies, which is a big claim that has been circulating on social media. And I would say that like Jewish indigeneity proponents are themselves like have made claims in that vein. So how did you find your interlocutors did or did not deal with? Because we've talked a lot about the cultural and political claims of indigeneity, but settler colonialism really does mobilize race and racialization through biology as well. So that's like the first part of the question. And then I'll say my thing and I'll end it on a question, which is what Emily was just saying in terms of what decolonization can look like in practice. I was struck with thinking about the concepts of Cheryl Harris's Whiteness and Property and Rabia Akbaria, who wrote a really great blog piece about how under Zionism, Jewishness is property, right? Like this is what claims of Zionism and indigeneity are for. Like we're talking about these kind of like big meta structures, but like what it is the state is attempting to control more and more land and turning it into property. That's what settler colonialism does. And I'm thinking about how ethnography has the power, but also maybe sometimes get caught in a trap of like there's no uniform Jewish subject that we can trace like directly from history, right? That's what Jewish indigeneity tries to do. Say like there was one Jews are like the Jew can be traced back since time immemorial. And so I'm wondering what strength you think ethnography does to undo that like universal arc of history of Jewishness, and also what are the limits to ethnography in doing that, because of the fact that ethnography is about that connection to the personal, to the lived, to like people's like identity. So I guess those are my two questions, one on the biological and one on the limits and possibilities of ethnography to do this decolonizing work intellectually.
Thank you, Gabi. Okay. Floor is open.
I'll try to be quick. I mean, first on the biological, it's super important. It came up in my work. It came up in my chapter when I was in the seminary, because here we have, women who are being told explicitly that they are not only racially different, they are Israelites, they're women from the tribe of Judah, they are returning to their native soil. They're also being told this on a theological basis, right? That they have a Jewish soul, right? They're being taught sort of mystical, I would say sort of spiritual racial concepts or mystical racial concepts about their Jewishness. So it's there, it's in my chapter. I definitely talk about it and try to tease it out, and how that operates vis-a-vis this sort of American whiteness that they're trying to flee. The question about ethnography, of course, it's, ethnography is thorny. It offers a particularly intricate interpersonal vantage point. What I think it does is that I do think that in the case of our book and the chapters in it, is that it certainly displaces an idea of one kind of continuous Jewish essence. I think it at least does that just by showing the sheer diversity of how this particular idea of Jewish indigeneity is being imagined and mobilized. I mean, the sheer creativity of the amount of different practices and discourses that have to be performed and engaged with absolutely destabilize a notion of some kind of unchanging Jewish essence in and of itself. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Emily, Ariel, any last points, reflections on Gabi's question?
I just echo, I think Gabby brought up a really important point, which is basically that settler colonialism is a process of capitalism. And I talked a little bit about capitalism in my presentation, but I would just echo that and emphasize that again, that what we're really talking about, again, is not necessarily identities and a clash of different people who are essentially different, but we're talking about a project of dispossession. And so the solution to that really lies in addressing capitalism. I think that that's an important piece of this, to understand how you can't decolonize without also resisting capitalism. And so that brings up a lot of questions about, for example, like with my presentation, where liberals fit into this and progressives who don't want to see the dismantling of capitalism go with that. But I do think the two are deeply intertwined, and you can't really have one without the other.
Thank you. Ariel, that leaves you with the last words, if you're so inclined.
Yes, so I'll refer to the question of the biocultural. Yeah, it definitely appears there in two different ways. One, and I can refer to another research that I've done with Daniel Monterescu about indigenous wines and indigenous grapes. It is an attempt to find the original native grapes of Israel and to reconstruct it as a Jewish story. Interestingly enough, Palestinians are doing just the same thing and publish their findings under Palestinian indigenous grapes. So you have exactly the same DNA, but sometimes it presents an Israeli ID and sometimes a Palestinian ID. But it talks specifically about the connection of a specific plant species to the land, and it talks about what plants are local and what species are invaders, and you can easily hear that they don't talk about plants but rather about people, and I think that this is fascinating because of the way that it uses modern science. The work is done in labs, and it tries to prove indigeneity as something that you can point at with a DNA analysis of grapes in this case. And the other way is talking about environmental racism, meaning that all of the Jewish farmers that we talked with said that Palestinians don't love their land because they use many pesticides and they throw the garbage and they don't care. And this proves that we love the place more, and then we just cross the dirt road to the Palestinian village of Susia. Okay, if we've been in the settlement of Susia and then to the Palestinian village of Susia, they would say exactly the same thing. We really use the same traditional ways of agriculture because we are connected to the land. They use industrial ways of agriculture. They are disconnected to the land with their greenhouses and pesticides, etc. So both sides use biology, definitely, the biocultural dimension.
Yeah, thank you so much. And it is now my turn to thank each and every one of you, your members of the audience, dedicated friends and supporters of the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies, for taking time away from your busy Wednesday afternoon and join us from different parts of the world in this fascinating, thought-provoking discussion, which first and foremost was also our opportunity to remember the beautiful, though short, life and legacy of a dear friend and colleague, Hayim Katsman. So, Rachel, I would like to thank you for accepting our invitation, actually bringing Hayim and the entire team, if not physically, but certainly emotionally and spiritually here to Montreal. So thank you for being here.
Thank you so much.
Richard, I would like to thank you for representing McGill Queen's University Press and being such a wonderful and dedicated partner and collaborator, and helping us bring to fruition and bring to life this beautiful book, as you've seen, makes such an important contribution to the debate and to the field of Israel studies. So thank you. Ariel, Emily, Joel unfortunately had to leave already, but I do want to thank you for joining in and agreeing to participate in this wonderful and very important event. Please remember that McGill Queen's University Press offers the generous discount I mentioned earlier. We will be sure to send the details of that information to you. And if you have friends, acquaintances who would like to watch the event and the conversation that took place here, please rest assured that since we recorded the event, we will make that recording also available. And everybody who registered today will get an email from us. And my last thank you then goes to the person who makes sure that all those emails are sent and that all the events can be brought to your screen effectively and in a timely manner as always. And that thank you goes to Corey Newman, our social media, technology and communications advisor. So Corey, thank you for everything that you do. We always look forward to welcoming you back into our classrooms, into our lecture halls, seminar rooms, but failing that, onto our screens. Stay healthy, stay strong, stay safe, everyone. And please join us again at our upcoming event next week. Bye.